In this lesson, we're taking a look at power chords. Now, power chords are one of the fundamentals of rock music. If you want some really clear examples of what power chords sound like, just go and listen to the start of Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, American Idiot by Green Day, or You Really Got Me by The Kinks, as they've all become pretty classic power chord riffs. Power chords allow us to play tons of songs using only one chord shape that jumps around the neck, and although more generally associated with electric guitar, often with distortion applied as well, I would also recommend learning power chords if you're an acoustic guitar player. There are some pretty cool songs that use power chords on acoustic, but the main reason is because power chords also function as a decent stepping stone towards bar chords, which is a bit more of a conventional goal for acoustic players. So this video is going to be the first lesson of my power chord series. Obviously in this lesson we're going to go over the chord shape and all the techniques involved, but then in the following videos there's going to be a bunch of song lessons which all use power chords, so you can really put them into practice and ingrain them into your playing. You can find the link to that playlist in the description. Now, before we take a look at the actual chord shape, I think there are a couple of things which are important to know at this stage. The first one is to really understand the movable aspect of these chords. So if you've only looked at open chords so far, open chords are all found in the same area of the neck but use a different shape, whereas power chords are the opposite. They all use the same shape but jump around the neck, and because of that it's really important that you're familiar with the names of the notes on the bottom two strings, because these are going to be your root notes. I did some lessons all about basic notes on the neck in series 3 of my beginner's course, so I'll pop a link to that in the video cards. And finally, just a little bit on terminology, because power chords can also be referred to as 5 chords because they consist of the musical interval of a fifth. So you might see an A power chord referred to as an A5 on a chord chart or a guitar tab, just to save a little bit of space. But generally when you're communicating with other musicians, particularly guitar players, they still tend to be referred to verbally as power chords. So it just depends on the context which naming you use. But I think that's everything you need to know to get started, so let's dive in. So power chords are often used with pretty heavy distortion, but I've just got a mild distortion on for the purposes of teaching, just for a bit of clarity. You can root power chords on either the low E or the A string. We're going to start with the low E string because it's a little bit of a simpler technique, and you've got to remember that wherever the first finger goes gives you the name of the chord, because that's the one playing the root note. So if I put my first finger on the 3rd fret on the low E string, this is the note G, and then I play a power chord in that position, I'd have a G power chord. If I pop my first finger on the note A, I'd have an A power chord. First finger on the note B, I'd have a B power chord. And then in between the A and B, I'd have either an A sharp or a B flat power chord. For the purpose of this lesson, we're going to start with an A power chord because it's pretty much in the middle of the zone of where you're going to be playing your power chords. So this is going to be rooted on the 5th fret of the low E string. Obviously, as you descend down in pitch, particularly down here to this F power chord right at the bottom, the chord's going to get a bit wider, so you have to stretch further. Whereas as I get up onto the higher frets, for example, up to this 10th fret, which would be a D power chord, it's going to get a little bit more squashy. So I would suggest starting in the middle, and then whichever way you take it, there's going to be a challenge either way. So you've just got to kind of gradually get used to it. Now, the stretchy aspect tends to be something that beginners particularly struggle with when it comes to learning power chords. So in order to help out with this, you want to try and get your first finger as close to the fret as possible. So you can see that I'm placing it in the 5th fret, you can see the dot underneath there, but I'm trying to push up to the fret on the body side of the guitar as much as possible without actually going on top of it, just right behind the metal fret there. Next, we're going to be placing the 3rd finger on the next string. So for this chord, that's going to be the A string, and it's going to be 2 frets higher. So the 7th fret. So far, we've got 1st finger playing 5th fret low E, and we've got 3rd finger playing 7th fret A. And then after that, we're also going to pop the little finger in the 7th fret on the next string. So little finger's just tucking in there on the D string, 7th fret. So we've got 1st finger on 5th fret low E, 3rd finger on 7th fret A, and little finger tucked underneath on 7th fret D. Now, the 3rd and little finger tend to cause a few problems when you're first learning power chords. Good ways to counteract this are to make sure that the little finger is pushed right up against the fret as much as it possibly can be. That creates space for this 3rd finger to tuck in and play at least somewhere in the middle of the fret. Generally what tends to go wrong is the stretch isn't wide enough, and then that forces this 3rd finger to the back of the fret, which if you remember from the beginner's course, tends to be where you get some pretty dodgy sounding notes. Whereas if you just stretch those fingers out a little bit, so that little finger's touching the fret and third finger's in the middle of the fret space. Then you tend to get more clarity in your notes, and you want to check that you can hear all three notes ringing out nice and clearly. It might take a little bit of time to get used to this stretch, so your chords might sound like this for a little bit. Might get a bit of a dodgy note in the middle, but just work on stretching them out until you can get all three ringing out nicely together, and that would be an A power chord using an E root. So we've covered the strings that you want to hear, but unfortunately that's only half the battle. We also have to talk about muting the remaining strings. So we've played the bottom three strings in pitch nice and clearly. However, if I let the top three strings ring out as well, and then play that as a full chord, that's not the sound that we want to hear. So we want to flatten that first finger so that it rests on the top three strings, keeps them all nice and muted, and then when I strum all the strings, I get that nice, tight and neat power chord sound. Now I want to talk a little bit about thumb placement to help you get this right. Generally, my recommendation for power chords is to place the thumb on the back of the neck. So as you're looking at me playing a power chord now, from that angle you can't see my thumb at all. I think this is a good thing to aim for. However, some people's natural reaction can be to bring the thumb over the top like this. The problem with this is that it generally tends to create quite a big natural arc in your fingers, so you tend to find that at least a couple of the unwanted strings start ringing out. I'll show you a little picture of where my thumb sits on the back of the neck so you can use that as a reference. However, everyone's hands are a slightly different shape, so don't worry if your thumb naturally sits in a bit of a different position to mine. It might be straighter or more angled, or sit slightly higher or lower. You've just got to find what works for you. And just a couple of final pointers. The first one being that you want to avoid having inverted fingers like this, where these two joints kind of fold in on themselves. That's neither good for comfort nor control when you're playing power chords. And final thing is that you want to avoid having a right angle in your wrist, so like this kind of thing. I'll show some stills to show exactly what I mean. You hear lots of people say that it can run the risk of soreness or even injury if you do it for a long time, so best to be avoided. You have to have a little bit of an angle in your wrist to be able to play the chords, but just make sure that it's not a heavy right angle, and that is everything you need to get started with these E root power chords. Now we're going to take a look at A root power chords, so using root notes on the A string, and we're going to be focusing on a D power chord for the purpose of this lesson. So first finger is going to sit on the note D, which is the 5th fret of the A string, and it's exactly the same shape that we had for the E root. So third finger goes on the next string 2 frets higher, and then little finger goes in the same fret on the next string as well. So here for this D power chord, we've got first finger playing the 5th fret A, third finger playing the 7th fret D, and little finger playing the 7th fret on the G string. Underside of first finger is also muting the B and high E in a similar way to what it was doing in the E root chord. So the big new challenge here is actually muting the low E string, because if I play that D power chord, but I leave the low E ringing out, that's a really nasty sound, and totally not what we want to hear. So we have to use whatever we can to mute that bottom string, and there are two options. The first one being the second finger can come over and just rest on the bottom string. You have to make sure that it touches it really lightly. If you press too hard, you'll actually play the note, and it's kind of like the worst note in the world. Sounds really messy, so you'll definitely hear straight away if your second finger is pressing too hard. You just want to touch the string gently enough to mute it, and also make sure that second finger isn't muting the A string, because you still want to hear that first finger playing your root note. So second finger coming over is the first option. The other option is to actually stretch out the first finger a little bit more and just touch the low E string with the tip of your first finger to mute it. So first finger's doing a double job of playing the A string and muting the low E string. Actually, it's more of a triple job because it's also muting the B and high E string as well. So asking a lot of first finger in that one, but you can totally get used to it. So just make sure you're muting the low E string somehow, either with middle finger or with the tip of first finger, and that'll keep your chords nice and neat. And that's everything that you need to know for the A root power chords. Obviously they can move left and right just like the E roots can. So here on the 3rd fret we'd have a C power chord, 5th fret we've had the D power chord, and up on the 7th fret we'd have an E power chord. So it works in exactly the same way. Another variation I want to talk about are two-note power chords, which crop up occasionally, and basically you're just losing the top note of the chord. So if we go back to the A power chord example with the first finger rooted on the 5th fret of the low E string, we'd just be losing that little finger note. So normally you'd hear the bottom 3 strings in a full power chord. But in the two-note variation, little finger's going to come off and you're just going to hear the low E in the A string, and first finger's now going to rest on the top 4 strings. And keep them nice and quiet. You can also play that note with the little finger as well. Little finger's freed up, so you've got the choice. So try them both and see what's more comfortable. Bands like Metallica tend to use these kind of chords because they just have a little bit of a darker sound. And of course you can also use them on the A string root as well. In this one I've got the first finger muting the bottom string, still got to get the muting in place. You can bring the second finger in and use the muting for that one as well. So a few options when it comes to these two-note power chords. You're only removing the octave of the root note, so not changing anything harmonically in the chord, but worth knowing about in case you come across them in songs. And the final thing I want to talk about for when you're comfortable with the power chords and you've got them sounding pretty strong is practicing movements. And a good place to start is moving between A and G using the E root chords. So if we start on the A power chord, you're going to be tensing the fingers to press the strings down, give it a strum, make sure it sounds good, and then for the movement you want to relax the fingers, slide down the strings to the G, tense them again, strum the chord, make sure it sounds good, relax, slide up, tense, relax, slide, tense, relax, slide, tense. And what you're working on here really is making sure that the shape doesn't change as you slide. So basically as you slide down, you're not bringing the fingers in together, which is quite a common problem because then you're going to end up with fingers in the wrong frets. Or even just if you do the slide back up to the A, making sure that your third and little fingers don't get pulled in. Even the slightest reduction in stretch can ruin the sound of your chord if I play it like that. You can hear I've got that third finger just not ringing out. You've got to keep everything nice and stretched out and as close to the frets as possible for that nice solid sound. So this basic movement where we're just keeping the fingers on the same strings and sliding down the frets is just training you to keep that shape nice and solid. The next stage of this process would be to do some regular down strums in the right hand and try and sync the change in power chord with the left hand. So if I start on the A and I'm just doing some down strums, I'll do 4 on each chord, then sync the change to the G. So I'm just doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's just training the synchronization of the change of your power chords with the strumming in the right hand, which is exactly what you need to do when playing songs. So we've looked at moving between different frets on the same string. Now let's stay in the same fret but change strings. So we'll do A power chord rooted on the bottom string to D power chord rooted on the A string. So we're going to have that A chord. Then all the fingers move up a string to the D chord. I'm getting the muting in with the tip of my first finger. Then back to that A chord, roll all the fingers up to the D chord. And the main thing that you're practicing here is that all the fingers move together, again trying to keep that power chord shape nice and solid, and you're not getting like first finger moving, then third, then little, or first finger and then the other two jumping back together. You want to make sure everything moves together in a solid shape. Check that both chords are sounding nice and strong. Check that your muting's automatically going into place. You might have to train that for a little bit. And then add your down strums to synchronize the change for this one as well. So and I'm sure you've guessed what's coming next. It's changing strings and frets at the same time. So for this one, we're going to start with a G power chord, and we're going to move between that and a D power chord. Now the tricky thing about this one is moving on to the next string while you're sliding, and I'm definitely focusing more on the tactile nature of the strings here. I'm definitely feeling a lot more than I'm looking. So as the fingers start sliding, I'm just feeling that each finger drops onto that next string as it makes its way up to the 5th fret. So there's the G. I'm starting sliding and I'm just feeling every finger move together onto that higher string. to get to the D chord, and then same on the way back down. I'm starting the slide down, just feeling every finger latch onto that lower string, and then I've got the G, and again, just move between them, make sure they're sounding good, make sure the muting's all in the right place. And then same process as before, start doing the 4 down strums. And if you can nail all these different types of changes, it's going to put you in a really good place to start learning all the songs in the power chord playlist. So there you have everything you need to get started with power chords. Harmonically, they're very simple chords, and that's why you're able to pile on the heavy distortion and still have that neat and tight sound, whereas with major and minor chords, they'll just start to sound a little bit messy if you use the same level of distortion. Remember, you need to be really familiar with the notes on the bottom 2 strings. They're your root notes, so you need to know them to be able to use power chords effectively. I've got lessons in Series 3 of my beginner's course if you're unfamiliar with that, so they might be worth checking out. Obviously, this lesson's been all about movable power chords. However, there is another set called open power chords which utilize open strings, so we're going to take a look at those in the next lesson as well, and then you'll have all the tools to start learning your favorite songs from the power chord playlist, which you can access in the video description. Be sure to subscribe if you want to follow along with the lessons, and I'd really appreciate you giving the video a like if you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.